So tonight's speaker, without further ado, is Professor Tilman Ruff AO. Tilman graduated in medicine from Monash University and specialised in infectious disease. And like one of our previous speakers, Professor Ian Gust, he worked at the Fairfield Infectious Diseases Hospital and worked on the control of hepatitis B virus across Indonesia and the Pacific Islands. Tilman has been a member of the Medical Association for Prevention of War in Australia for over 30 years and is a co-president of International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. He's the co-founder and founding international and Australian chair of ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And of course, in 2017, ICAN was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for drawing attention to the consequences of nuclear weapons, as well as for its efforts to achieve a prohibition of nuclear weapons. So it's a tremendous honour and privilege to invite Tilman to talk to us about ending nuclear weapons era, evidence, challenges and pathways. Over to you, Tilman. Please start sharing your screen.
Sure. Look, thanks very much, David, for the kind introduction and also for the invitation to speak with you. One really couldn't be talking about these issues at a more relevant, crucial moment in history. So thanks for that. I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from a Winnana country. I'm down in Hobart at the moment, and I'll get started with the presentation. And yes, I'm very happy to have interruptions or if anything I say is unclear or outrageous, and look forward to the discussion. So I'll just share my screen and hopefully you can all see the slides in presentation mode.
Correct.
So yeah, pleased to be speaking with you. Now I'll get this machine to work. Nuclear weapons are not, some divinely ordained creation, that we have no control over. These are machines that were built by human beings and can be dismantled by human beings, as over 80% of those that have ever been built have been. It's a really crucial, unfinished business that ought to be, many people should be aware much more now than perhaps they were before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, just how urgent that unfinished business is. So in terms of who's got what with nuclear weapons, these are numbers. The best estimates are provided by Hans Christensen and Matt Corder at the Federation of American Scientists. Extraordinarily good and continuing publicly available research. So their estimates from just a couple of weeks ago are 12,705 nuclear weapons. You can see that roughly 90% of those remain in the hands of Russia and the United States, with about 1,000, but a growing number in other hands. The World Health Organization, when it first produced a landmark report back in 1983 on the effects of nuclear war on health and health services, that was presented to the World Health Assembly, the body of health ministers that govern the organization, and they concluded unanimously, that concurred with the report's conclusion, that these weapons constitute the greatest immediate threat to health and welfare. And unfortunately, the veracity of that conclusion is really only strengthened by subsequent evidence. The first WHO report really made clear that no health services, singly or in combination, anywhere in the world could really respond adequately to the effects of even a single nuclear detonation on an urban centre. And therefore, from a health point of view, really the only logical evidence-based approach is for primary prevention, to prevent this possibility from occurring, which essentially requires the elimination of the weapons. What do nuclear weapons do? they're not just big versions of other explosive devices. They also have some unique features, and I'm not going to labour this because some of this will be well known to you, but if there's a ground burst, so if the fireball actually touches the ground, then there can be a very large crater generated. The blast has both a static overpressure and a dynamic blast wave that are extremely damaging. And from a military point of view, this is what usually determines the nature of the weapons, the size of the weapons, the height of the burst that's planned, depending on how hardened or how tough the target is. Obviously bigger and closer to the ground for hardened or buried targets. So this has been the focus of military planning, and this is sort of understood in meticulous detail from the 2058 nuclear tests that have been conducted since 1945. The bigger civilian impacts relate to these other effects, and we'll come to some of these, but heat, the radiation that's unique to nuclear weapons, both an initial pulse of mainly gamma radiation, followed by local and global fallout. So from a military point of view, there is often a tension between maximising the military effect while not wanting to exacerbate the humanitarian effects, because to get a big blast wave to reliably destroy a hardened military target, you need a ground burst, which generates much more radioactive fallout than an air burst. So the fallout really is distributed locally, regionally, principally in the sort of band of latitude in which the explosions occur, but also diffuses globally and across the hemispheres, really according to the weather. And then there's a effect that's discussed rather little, which I won't say a lot about, but it's important from a humanitarian point of view, this electromagnetic pulse effect, which is essentially nuclear weapons create a very powerful electromagnetic pulse that on average would be about 1 million or more times that generated by lightning. And a high altitude nuclear explosion, just a single one at sort of 300 or 400 kilometers up, would create such a pulse that would essentially damage electrical and electronic circuitry on really a continental scale. And virtually all civilian electrical equipment is not specifically hardened against this. Some military equipment is, but virtually no civilian equipment is. So that means everything connected to the electrical grid, communications, basically all the electronic devices that underpin modern life, from traffic lights to ATMs to ventilators and cardiac monitors in hospitals, are vulnerable to this effect. So the civilian disruptions from even a single nuclear explosion could be indirectly extremely high from such an explosion. The most important new science about that underpins our understanding of what nuclear weapons do is really related to their climate impact. So that's what I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking on. And most of us, and I think most people, don't think of nuclear weapons when they think about climate disruption and climate change. But really, I hope that you'll be convinced at the end of this review of the current evidence that really nuclear weapons pose the most acute, immediate threat to the stable and hospitable climate that we need. It's vulnerable, of course, to global heating, but it's also vulnerable to the abrupt, essentially ice age conditions that would be created by even a surprisingly small regional nuclear war. So let me take you through sort of how and why that happens. It happens basically because nuclear weapons are extraordinarily efficient at igniting fires over a very large area. So even the relatively small, by today's standards, tactical sized 15 kilotons of high explosive equivalent weapon that was dropped on Hiroshima in 1945 is estimated to have released about 1,000 times as much energy in the fires it ignited as the explosion itself, which was obviously not trivial. A large nuclear weapon would would have extraordinary ignition potential. So in Hiroshima, about 13 square kilometres burned comprehensively. The largest deployed nuclear weapons today are in China. They're up to 5 megatons, so 5 million tonnes of high explosive equivalent. On a city, that would basically create confluent fires over about a 45, 46 kilometre radius, so 1,600 square kilometres. In Melbourne, that's from sort of Greenvale out to Warrandyte, down past Seaford, you know, an enormous area. Most of the greater Melbourne urban area would be, everything flammable would burn: paper, cloth, most plastics, a lot of waste, oil and petroleum products, plastics, bitumen, everything flammable would burn at, you know, temperatures over 800 degrees Celsius, consuming most of the oxygen, and within that confluent fire zone, essentially nothing could survive. So, so I'm not sure why this is jumping around, but there's no other weapon really, because of the scale, that can be so effective at inducing fires, and actually smaller yield weapons. So there's been a trend for the yield of nuclear weapons to decrease. So it's now, the average size weapon is about 200 kilotons. So that's about 13 times the size of the Hiroshima bomb, down from probably closer to a megaton in the past. But actually, the fire ignition and lethality effects of nuclear weapons are a kiloton for kiloton are about 100 times greater for low yield weapons than for high yield weapons. So those effects aren't proportional to the explosive yield. So the most sort of detailed work, just for plausible examples' sake, is of an India-Pakistan war. Is that bar at the top annoying you, like it's annoying me and covering a bit of the slide?
I don't know how to get rid of it.
Nor do I. It's a bit annoying, isn't it? I wonder if I could move it or get rid of it. Hide the names of. Don't know how to get rid of it. It is annoying. It's covering up my titles.
So I'm seeing the title "Small Regional Nuclear War."
Oh yeah, okay.
Right, so it might be just you that's.
All right, I'm not, so that's fine. Don't worry then.
Yeah.
So this scenario, which has been sort of regularly updated, looks at a pretty detailed and plausible scenario for what an India-Pakistan war that escalates to use of nuclear weapons might look like. These two countries have, with China, the most rapidly growing nuclear arsenals in the world. So 250 nuclear weapons is less than 2% of the global nuclear arsenal. And I'll show you scenarios for, the work looks at 15, 50 or 100 kiloton weapons, but I'll focus on the 50 just because it's sort of in the middle and it's probably pretty realistic. It's not an unlikely scenario. There's been 4 major wars between India and Pakistan since 1949. They've mobilized very large numbers of troops on a couple of further occasions. In the most recent serious tensions, when an Indian plane was shot down over Pakistan, it's pretty reliably reported that nuclear weapons use was considered on both sides at that time. Both have policies for relatively early use of nuclear weapons if they're being invaded and overrun, and that's particularly relevant for Pakistan with a much smaller army than India. And this, of course, such a war would of course have horrendous local casualties in South Asia. But it's really the climate effects I want to draw your attention to. Depending on the size of these weapons, somewhere between 16 and 36 million tonnes of sooty black smoke, so that's black carbon in smoke, would be lofted high into the atmosphere. It's less than 2% of the global arsenal, and it's significantly less than 1% of the total yield, because these are, you know, disproportionately small compared with the 200 kiloton average size of the weapon in the global arsenal. So the smoke from such a war in South Asia would basically cover the inhabited regions of the planet within 10 days or so, and basically cover the whole planet within a couple of weeks. And it would go very high in the atmosphere. I've got a nice animation of that, but I'll just not show it to you. But essentially, the smoke goes up into the stratosphere and the mesosphere. It goes really high, and the upper atmosphere gets 50 to 80 degrees hotter because of all that black smoke sitting up there. There's no weather beyond the troposphere, so there's no rain out. There's particulate material that gets up there sticks around for a very long time, and the data show that this essentially this is for the different scenarios in terms of decline in precipitation and temperature, and you can see that the effects don't really resolve until well past a decade later, and essentially these are global average surface temperature reductions. So the 50 kiloton sort of median weapon size is the black line. So, and these are obviously the bigger ones and the smaller ones. So this purple bar is the range of temperatures below present at the maximum of the last glaciation about 20,000 years ago. So this is the conditions when the Earth was subject to an ice age. How low did the temperatures get? And you can see that this regional nuclear war involving less than 2% of the global nuclear arsenal would get us to well within that range within, abruptly within a couple of days. And there are also very significant declines in global precipitation. There would also be an enormous depletion because of all that both the heating of the stratosphere and all of that substrate of smoke. Ozone destruction would be dramatically accelerated to levels that we really haven't seen, in any recent geological era. Dramatic declines in global ozone. To really very severe reductions with subsequent increases in ultraviolet radiation. So what would that do? I'm sorry, I can't see the headings, but I should know this stuff pretty well now. But essentially what one way of looking at what would be the impacts is what would be the total, in terms of biological impacts, is what would be the effects on net primary productivity. So what's left over that plants produce that's not used for their own growth and respiration. And you can see that in the ocean, there's around a sort of 10 to 20% decline for several years, and on land, it's considerably greater, around 20% plus. That reduction is roughly comparable to the total current human consumption of food and fiber. And you can see that that's not evenly distributed. So in heavily populated regions, much of South and Southeast of East and Southeast Asia, much of the northeastern part of the Americas, sort of Middle Africa, those declines are greater than 100%. I mean, it's really significant decline. So yeah, it's essentially comparable to the total current human use of food and fiber. What impact does that have on agricultural crops? For most of the major food crops, particularly the grain crops, which have been modelled, there are really significant declines. This is detailed data for maize. And you can see in the already cool high latitude regions of the Northern Hemisphere, Southern Canada, Northern US, most of Europe, most of Russia, Northern China and Korea, northern part of Japan, agriculture would basically stop. Food production would essentially cease, with, globally about a third decline in production. And maize is a reasonably hardy crop for for rice and some of the others main crops, it's the effects are greater. So how might we fare with that kind of decline in major food production? Well, currently the Food and Agriculture Organization estimate that around 770 million people in 2020 were chronically malnourished, didn't have enough to eat. It's significantly more than the year before. And the number of, it's estimated that this grew by more than 100 million, basically because of COVID. 137 million increase is the most recent estimate. And also the number of food insecure, at least moderate extent, food insecure people has risen substantially, and even more than that chronically malnourished number. So it's now around 2.5 billion people. Global grain reserves bob around typically between 2 and 4 months of consumption. They're pretty good at the moment at around sort of 115 days worth, but that's not going to get us through, you know, a decade of severely reduced production. So, you know, even very simple sort of estimates, you can get a sense that billions of people around the world would be at risk of starvation from a small regional nuclear war just in one part of the planet. And the historical lessons of severe famines in the past is that they are inevitably accompanied by epidemics of multiple enteric and contact and respiratory infectious diseases, and often trigger conflict, usually within, but and often also between states. Reasonably likely in a famine of such magnitude, there'd be an awful lot of squabbling over the food reserves that remained. So some of the climate scientists that have done this work have really sort of drawn the conclusion that, you know, the theory of sort of mutually assured destruction that has kind of underpinned the theory of nuclear deterrence, that rational leaders won't invite unacceptable consequences by initiating the use of nuclear weapons, is really inappropriate. The evidence clearly supports the idea of self-assured destruction, that any use of nuclear weapons really makes, to a very significant extent, meaningless distinctions between winners and losers. These effects, of course, wouldn't discriminate on where the nuclear weapons were launched or even where they detonated. So the appropriate analogy is really that these are global suicide bombs that we just can't use. The stuff that puts the nuclear in nuclear weapons, highly enriched uranium or plutonium, or both, from which nuclear weapons are made, is present in extraordinarily large quantities, about 1,330 tons of highly enriched uranium. You need around 12 to 15 kilograms of HEU for a nuclear weapon, and about 550 tons of separated plutonium. You need about 3 or 4 kilograms for a nuclear weapon. So basically hundreds of thousands of nuclear weapons worth of material exists in the current civilian and military stockpiles. So clearly stopping the production of these materials, securing it at the highest level and eliminating it where possible is going to be an essential task in not so much achieving, but particularly sustaining a world free of nuclear weapons. So if it happened, it would be bad, catastrophic really. What are the chances of nuclear war happening? Well, unfortunately, with an important exception I'll come to, there's not a lot that's going in the right direction, even before the current precipitous calamity in Ukraine that Russia has initiated. So every state in the world has a variety of legal, political, and treaty obligations to eliminate nuclear weapons, but basically it's not happening. And none of the nuclear armed states are showing any seriousness in disarming. In fact, we've seen the hard-won treaties that are the fruits of the end of the First Cold War that have constrained nuclear weapons numbers and types, progressively abandoned. When the Biden administration came to office in early last year, Biden renewed the New START treaty with Russia. That would have expired, and he renewed it just 2 days before it would have otherwise expired. And that was the last remaining treaty constraint on US and Russian nuclear weapons. All of the others having progressively been abandoned, one has to say, typically initially by the US. And there are no serious negotiations. Before the Ukraine war, they had at least started ongoing talks at a high level, but there are no actual negotiations about anything, and even those talks have stopped. Maybe even worse than that, but all of them are actually not just sitting on what they've got, but they're investing very substantially in modernization. So the numbers only tell you really a small part of the story, because all of the 9 nuclear armed states are investing in new nuclear weapons with significantly new capacities that make them more flexible, more accurate, more stealthy, and often blur the distinction between conventional weapons and nuclear weapons by using the same delivery vehicle, i.e. the same missile can carry a conventional or a nuclear warhead. So the adversary state wouldn't know which warhead was on it until it landed. The number of weapons that are actually deployed and the number of weapons on high alert is increasing, even though the overall number is tending to reduce, because the overall number includes quite a few thousand weapons that are waiting to be dismantled. Spending, even during the era of COVID, on nuclear weapons is actually, this is annoying, it just goes ahead by itself, sorry, is actually going up. And nuclear warhead spending in the US is at an all-time record level, including during the Cold War, with them estimated projected expenditures of over 2 trillion over the next 30 years in essentially revamping the whole nuclear arsenal and the facilities that produce it. And Russia has been very aggressively developing and deploying a whole range of new types of nuclear weapons, including ones we haven't seen before, like a nuclear-powered cruise missile powered by a small nuclear reactor. It's deploying hypersonic delivery vehicles, and it's deployed a nuclear torpedo, the idea being you send it into a harbour and explode it adjacent to a major city. The doomsday clock is perhaps the best known sort of regular authoritative assessment of how we're tracking on the major kind of existential threats of particularly nuclear weapons and global heating. In 2020, for the first time, they moved their hands as far forward as they'd have, further forward than they'd ever been before, which is 100 seconds to midnight. And in 21 and 22, they do this on an annual basis. They left them there because basically progress, whilst there's been some steps forward, there's been offsetting steps backward of at least the same degree. So that's a fairly grim assessment, and this is no lightweight group. There are 13 Nobel laureates on the board of sponsors of the bulletin. You don't want to take this mob, ignore them. And, the world's most senior diplomat has been saying some pretty strong stuff. We're in a new Cold War, we're in dangerous times. The risks are really, really profound. There's 2 other dimensions. This is even before Russia invaded Ukraine. There's 2 other dimensions that I particularly want to draw your attention to that are changing. One is that a climate-stressed world is a more dangerous place, a more conflict-prone world. This is from the database that's maintained at Uppsala University on armed conflict around the world, which is probably the best, I think. And you can see that the number of this is really annoying, sorry about this. The number of armed conflicts has increased very dramatically in the last decade after a kind of a decline in the first decade of this century. And the biggest increase in this sort of pink section has been in internationalized intrastate conflict. So that's a conflict in one state that involves at least one nation outside it. And those are disproportionately the biggest and nuclear armed states. So each of these, if they involve a nuclear armed state, does pose some risk of nuclear escalation. And that's, so a climate stressed world is a more dangerous place as armed conflict gets more common. And the other, of course, really emerging, extremely difficult to manage area of increased risk is the whole area of cyber warfare and cyber attacks, to which we know that nuclear command and control systems are vulnerable. And there's been a number of really concerning incidents of agencies involved in managing nuclear weapons being hacked, including the National Nuclear Security Administration in the US, with a really extensive hack of many US government agencies just over a year ago. So this puts a whole additional layer of risk and instability, potentially not just in the hands of the many governments that are involved in cyber warfare, but also potentially non-state actors in a way that they couldn't otherwise potentially get access to nuclear weapons. I just want to say something about the Ukraine war, because it's such an acute tragedy at the moment, in terms of, I really think that it's not too great an overstatement to say that this poses the greatest risk of nuclear confrontation between the states with, between them 94 or 5% of the world's nuclear weapons than we've seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Russia has about 1,600 deployed strategic weapons and almost 2,000 tactical nuclear weapons, so smaller, short-range weapons that are designed for kind of battlefield use. The US has roughly the same number and a smaller number of tactical nuclear weapons, but it does deploy about 100 nuclear bombs in 5 European countries, which would be delivered by the air force of those countries: Belgium, Germany, Turkey, Italy, and the Netherlands. France has an additional 280 and the UK an additional 120 deployed strategic nuclear weapons. All of the estimated 2,000 nuclear weapons in the world that are on high alert, that are ready to be launched within a couple of minutes of a decision to do so, are in those 4 countries: Russia, the US, France, and the UK. So that makes them much more vulnerable to inadvertent accidental launch or launch by cyber attack. President Putin has really escalated the nuclear stakes in this by taking some very aggressive actions of threatening any country that interferes with the invasion of Ukraine with a pretty thinly veiled threat of nuclear attack, put Russian nuclear forces on a higher level of alert. After this invasion began, conducting multiple exercises of nuclear launch vehicles and forces, proclaiming that the sanctions regime that's been applied to Russia amounts to a declaration of war. And in the context where really this invasion is extraordinarily brutal and in breach of the international humanitarian law, the laws of war, and is also unprecedented in its attacks on both Chernobyl and the largest operating nuclear power plant in Europe, in Zaporizhia. And yesterday just upped the stakes with an attack on a base that's been subject to NATO use very close to the Polish border. So this is really an extraordinarily dangerous situation. Thankfully, the US hasn't responded in kind to any of this sort of ratcheting up of the tensions. But this is a really, really dangerous situation. And I think, the risks being at least as great as those during the Cuban Missile Crisis is not an exaggeration. There's also, on a slightly separate tack, but the profound risks of not a nuclear explosion or nuclear war, but of a radiological disaster that could actually be larger in scale than a nuclear explosion. If the reactors or the spent fueling ponds at one of Ukraine's 4 operating nuclear plants, especially in Zaporizhzhia, which unprecedentedly was subject to a military attack on the 4th of March, resulting in fires that you can see there and damage also to at least one of the high voltage power lines supplying power to the plant that you can see in the background was also disrupted. If the water supply or the cooling to either the spent fuel ponds, which have no containment structures other than a simple building over them, or the reactors were disrupted for more than a minute, then a meltdown of a core of a reactor would occur. And the potential for a massive radiological release from a fire or explosion or both is really severe. And that could happen not just by a direct military attack on a reactor or a spent fuel pond, whether deliberate or inadvertent, or by separatists that are not under firm Russian control, that have got some pretty heavy weapons, as they showed us when they shot down the Malaysian airliner MH17. But it could also happen if the power or the cooling water supplies were disrupted, as we saw in Fukushima. So this is a non-nuclear weapons related, but another profound radiological risk associated with the current conflict. This is the first time we've seen such a war in a country with multiple operating nuclear power plants. So what about progress? Where does hope lie? Where does the route forward lie? What are the potential points of action that are most likely to be productive? Well, if you look at the historical lessons of controlling other indiscriminate and inhumane weapons, the biological, chemical, landmines, cluster munitions. Sorry, this is just so annoying. The common feature for all of those, of the significant progress that we've made, not complete, but very significant progress in controlling those weapons, the key lesson for all of them was that an essential step was codifying in law with a consistent standard for all states, the standard of zero weapons, that these weapons are unacceptable, that they're beyond the pale for all nations. And that those treaties have provided the impetus and the motivation for the progressive efforts to eliminate the weapons. And crucially, those treaties have had a significant impact even on the countries that haven't joined them. So let me give you an example of landmines. And cluster munitions. Neither the US, Russia, or China joined or supported the negotiations on any of those treaties. But with the anomaly of the Trump administration, at every UN meeting I've been to in the last 8 years, US officials would boast their virtual compliance with the landmines ban, despite the fact that they didn't join it. They don't produce cluster munitions anymore in the US. The production, use, deployment, trade of each of these weapons has dramatically declined once a treaty has codified a norm and built over time. That's the lesson of history. But until the last few years, this approach of stigmatization and delegitimization through prohibition had not been applied to nuclear weapons. So how did we get to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons? Well, ICAN had a significant role, and I'm, of course, really proud of that. This was an initiative of health professionals. It was established by International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War and the Medical Association for Prevention of War. In 2007, we launched it really inspired by the example of the landmines ban, and dismayed by the failure of disarmament that was sort of so palpable by then. So it's now become the major partner for governments in the negotiation of the treaty. And we decided to take the approach of a really clear, simple goal, a treaty to provide for and to prohibit nuclear weapons and provide for their elimination, and based not on politics and security arguments, but the kind of evidence I've shown you about their impacts. That's been the basis for ICAN's work, and I think one of the reasons for its effectiveness. But another crucial organisation in what has become known as the humanitarian initiative of the last 12 years or so, that's really tried to change the debate about nuclear weapons to be much more focused on the humanitarian impacts and unacceptability of the weapons, has been the world's largest humanitarian organisation, the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, which in 2010 really took a major step in focusing on the unfinished business of getting rid of the worst weapons of mass destruction. That helped to initiate a process that was then really given significant reinforcement with evidence by 3 evidence-based meetings in Norway, Mexico, and Austria in 2013 and 14, that were the first dedicated meetings where governments actually sat down to consider the impacts of nuclear weapons. Extraordinary that it took so long for such an event to happen. And the evidence that was presented really without significant challenge, and 80% of the world's governments were at the Vienna conference, was that any use of nuclear weapons would be a catastrophe for which no effective response was possible, that the risks had been underestimated and were likely growing, and that there was this legal gap, that the most destructive of all weapons was not the sort of last weapon of mass destruction, not yet to be prohibited. So at the end of the Vienna conference, the Austrian foreign minister, now the chancellor, was 27 at the time, initiated a pledge committing Austria to want to work to fill that legal gap, and invited other nations to join. And pretty quickly, about 2/3 of the world's governments joined. There's 194 nations in the world. That's about 2/3 of them. So, clearly that's a significant development. And that then culminated in negotiations mandated by the UN General Assembly that happened in 2017 to negotiate a new instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons. And by the way, while you're at it, try and progress, try and put in place the structures that will provide for the elimination of the weapons as much as you can. But you've only got 3 weeks to do it, basically. So there was some preliminary meetings, but then in actual negotiations, there was really only a week in March and then 3 weeks in June, July, and the mandate expired. So if the treaty hadn't have been ready by the 7th of July, that mandate would have expired, and we would have been starting all over again. So there was a lot of time pressure, but it's extraordinary that we could get a treaty, a complex international instrument. These things normally take years and sometimes decades, over basically 8 months from the mandate, and with 4 weeks of actual negotiations. All praise be to this extraordinary woman, Ambassador Elaine White-Gomez, who presided over that meeting. This was a remarkable process where the scientists and physicians had opportunities to present to the delegates even during the negotiations. And one of the things that was incredibly powerful was not just evidence, but evidence presented with united voice. And I'm really proud of the fact that, the messages that we developed were supported by other health professional global federations, the World Medical Association, World Federation of Public Health Associations, the International Council of Nurses. So speaking with united voice in these fora, with submissions, working papers, oral testimony, op-eds, etc., made it very much more powerful than any organisation on its own. And it was also particularly powerful combining that evidence. These are difficult issues to confront and to grasp, and pretty unpleasant to think about. What can make it real for people, in this sort of great power chess game world? is the lived experience of the survivors of the nuclear bombings in Japan and the nuclear test survivors around the world. And I'm so proud of some of the Indigenous test survivors from Australia, Auntie Sue Coleman Hasseldine and Karina Lester in particular, who really made that real and who touched the diplomats with such compelling testimony in a way that really nothing else could have, and reminded them of why their work was so urgent and important. This treaty may not have happened without their input. Really powerful contributions. Karina is Yummy Lester's daughter. Yummy may be better known to some of you. So because the 9 nuclear armed states and their 32 accomplice states that claim protection from somebody else's nuclear weapons stayed away, pretty much the rest of the world gets this, and the vote was pretty overwhelming, and a really historic moment. So nuclear weapons are now subject to that same legal standard of prohibition as the other major classes of inhumane and indiscriminate and weapons of mass destruction. So where are we now? 86 countries have signed, 59 have ratified. It takes obviously some time. They've copped some flack. There's been a few other issues to deal with in the last couple of years. So that number is steadily growing. And of course, each additional signatory adds to to the weight and force of the treaty. The number 50, which was set as the number of ratifications that will trigger entry into force of the treaty, was achieved in October 2020. So the treaty entered into force 90 days later in January of last year. So for the states that have joined it, they are now bound by its provisions. They're fairly widely scattered. There's obviously not all of them are here, but you can see that they're fairly widely scattered around the world. In our region, all of the states of ASEAN, the 10 of them except for Singapore, have joined the treaty. Almost all the independent Pacific Island states and New Zealand have joined and support the treaty. And again, the health professional collaboration expanding to include now the International Committee of the Red Cross and the Medical Students Federation, welcoming this entry into force. So what's in this treaty? It's really evidence-based. It's got some really clear summaries of the evidence about why nuclear weapons are unacceptable. It does provide a really comprehensive and strong prohibition on anything to do with nuclear weapons. And it provides pathways for all states to join, those that have had nuclear weapons in the past, or currently those that have nuclear weapons stationed on their territory, or those like Australia that assist in possible use of nuclear weapons of another state, even if they haven't got them themselves. And it's got, for the first time in the nuclear field, obligations on states parties to assist the victims of nuclear use and testing, and to assist with the remediation of environments contaminated by nuclear use or testing. Obviously, that's much more difficult than, in the case of cluster munitions and landmines, where you can pick up a discrete munition. You can't really pick up radioactive contamination that's widely dispersed. But these are really important obligations that haven't previously existed. And as I mentioned, that treaty is now in force. And no reservations means states have to sign on to this whole treaty lock, stock and barrel. They can't pick and choose between its various provisions if they join. And it's the historic significance of the treaty was, I think, recognised with the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize that David kindly referred to. And I just want to draw your attention that it's basically for evidence-based advocacy. That's what the treaty was for, in a way that had political traction that helped to get the treaty. And I hope you all know and are proud too that this was the first Nobel Peace Prize awarded to an entity, an organisation or an individual born in this country. One of the early impacts of the treaty has been in financial institutions divesting encouraging divestment from the producers of nuclear weapons, which are pretty big money. So this is the amount of money in US dollars that was documented to have been invested in nuclear weapons companies over a recent 2-year period. You know, these are big companies. This is serious money, and there's a whole bunch of financial institutions now rapidly growing in number that are divesting from such holdings, largely on the basis of the treaty that you know, that these are now weapons that are prohibited under international law. And some of them are pretty important. You know, the biggest pension fund in Europe, the world's largest sovereign wealth fund, some major financial institutions in Japan. You know, there are, and the number of financial institutions that are divesting is growing. In Australia, the 4 big banks, this is data from a few years ago, this has been hard to find, you know, have significant investments in about $7 billion between them. They had then in companies that profit from making nuclear weapons. We think insurance and the super industry probably have more than that invested. One Australian super fund, Australian Super, has $1.5 billion itself invested in companies that make nuclear weapons. But there are a growing number of Australian, one bank and now a number of super funds that are excluding nuclear weapons from their portfolios. And the Responsible Investment Association of Australia, that's the umbrella body that sort of gives its stamp to ethical investment products, has given notice that from January this year, that by next year, for a financial product in Australia to be considered ethical or socially responsible, it will have to exclude nuclear weapons. So that's a significant development. There are also issues around academic institutions partnering with organisations that profit from making weapons of mass destruction, including some that some of us are involved with, which is pretty distressing. The treaty doesn't preclude, this is important in an Australian context, doesn't preclude non-nuclear military cooperation with a nuclear armed state. A whole bunch of senior people who ought to know have said this. Most of the US's major non-NATO allies have supported the treaty, and 3 of them, all in our region, Thailand, Philippines, and New Zealand, have actually ratified the treaty to date. And there's been no disruption to their ongoing military cooperation with the US because it doesn't involve nuclear weapons. So that's an important point for Australia. Australia has opposed the treaty, unfortunately, quite consistently. And that's really in stark contrast to the variably bipartisan support that has led to Australia having joined, in some cases having played a really leading role in relation to chemical weapons, all of the other treaties that prohibit indiscriminate weapons. There is very wide public support, and we just commissioned an opinion poll which happened last week that showed 76% of the public want Australia to join this treaty. 38 local councils, the Australian Local Government Association, many faith-based organisations, many health organisations, a huge number of civil society organisations in Australia support us signing up to it. And we have a cross-party tool of inviting parliamentarians to commit their public support for the treaty, which has over 240 now in total, including about 90 federal parliamentarians, disproportionately on the Labor side. 3/4 of Labor parliamentarians have joined this pledge, but we do have Greens, Independents, Nats, Libs, all parties. The Alternative Party of Government, the Labor Party, in 2018 adopted a specific policy commitment to sign and ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons when they're next in government. So that's a really promising position for us to be in. And that was, reaffirmed at the national conference March last year. I'm conscious that I'm going on for a bit long, so I'll just skip a couple of these, but we do have significant ways for local councils to support this, and divestment is one of the things that they're really getting behind. So the nuclear weapons really pose this question, I think, as really an existential challenge of our age. You know, will it be the end of nuclear weapons or the end of us? It's going to be one of those two things, and we all know what the answer to that question needs to be. I think the treaty is a really important positive step. It's really the main good news in this space, and it's a tool that, you know, is really begging to be used to build towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. I think stabilising the climate, protecting it from both uncontrolled heating and nuclear ice age, and getting rid of nuclear weapons are really preconditions for everything else that matters, that we might work or strive for. And evidence-based advocacy has played a really critical role in this process, and I think will continue to play a really critical role. It's been the basis for most of the progress that we've seen on controlling nuclear weapons have really happened because of an understanding on the part of the public and or leaders of really the existential dangers that these weapons pose. So for those of us involved in collecting and defending and drawing the policy implications of evidence, we have a really important role to play. Thanks very much.
That was absolutely wonderful, Tilman. So I'll invite people to ask questions using the chat function. And I'll start off with Chairman's privilege and ask you a question myself. Tilman, you mentioned University of Melbourne, who I dare say you've got an association with. I certainly have an association with them. What more can they do, and what more can we do to make them do more?
There have been a few efforts to engage with the university on this, both by staff and students, and by the Medical Association for Prevention of War and a national student network that's been concerned about universities collaborating with weapons companies. This is not a unique feature to Melbourne. I mean, as the funding environment, you know, for universities and for research has grown more competitive and government funding has shrunk, and the military budget in Australia has grown enormously, the presence of international weapons companies in Australia with multi-billion-dollar contracts seeking to promote, you know, their public image in Australia has grown enormously, and they've become quite active sponsors of STEM research and teaching activities, you know, from primary school maths competitions to, you know, through high schools and universities. Most of the big weapons manufacturers are actually also involved in nuclear weapons. Thales, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, BAE Systems, you know, Serco. Most of the big ones are involved in nuclear weapons. And so this is certainly not a unique problem to Melbourne University, but it's actually a pretty small amount of money in terms of the overall picture of university funding. And I think it profoundly compromises, you know, the ethical position, the integrity of public institutions dedicated to training the next generations, you know, in essential skills that society needs, and promoting public good and being a cultural and intellectual collective resource. It's really unfortunate for universities to have such links. And I think there are various ways of framing this. You know, some people have reservations about any collaboration in military research, or and that, you know, those links have existed with government, with not just with the Defence Science and Technology Organisation, not just with private companies. You can argue about that, and, you know, there may be some reasonable justification for military research with, reasonable applications. I mean, particularly things like demining, for example. You wouldn't have profoundly humanitarian in its intent. But when you're talking about weapons of mass destruction, weapons that are prohibited by international treaty, that are considered by the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, the world's largest humanitarian organisation and custodian of the laws of war, of international humanitarian law, that are considered indiscriminate and inhumane by the Red Cross, I think the line is pretty clear, and I think that's the position that certainly I would advocate. That companies that have involvements in weapons that are either weapons of mass destruction, that are prohibited by international treaty, or that are considered indiscriminate and inhumane by the Red Cross, would be very defendable moral position to take. And I think the sort of, I don't feel great about that association. It doesn't improve my motivation or commitment to the, the institution. I know lots of people who feel that way. There has been face-to-face engagement with the university leadership on this, with the heads of engineering and physics, where most of the funding has gone to postdoc and PhD scholarships, with senior academics, DVC research, but it's met fairly little receptivity, and I have to be honest to say that I'm really disappointed that the current Vice Chancellor has consistently refused to even meet staff to discuss this issue. So I think it's something that we really should take up, those of us who work in and care about the institutions that we work in, particularly now that we have this international treaty that prohibits nuclear weapons, and in this grand scheme of things, the proportion of funds that are so provided, are not large, and at the very least, those relationships should not be renewed, and no new ones should be entered into. And there are some precedents for a range of other organisations withdrawing from such partnerships, major social justice organisations, major environmental organisations in Australia that have actually had similar accepted funds from Lockheed Martin or BAE or others. Some of them have renounced those.
Yeah, well, universities have cut ties with, tobacco funders, and they've cut ties with, with some universities with thermal coal producers. So there is a precedent. Absolutely.
A precedent for companies that are involved in inherently unhealthy or harmful products.
There's a question from Malcolm Jenkins. Do you have any affiliation with the Pugwash conferences? Oh, that's a blast from the past. Pugwash conferences on science and world affairs.
For any younger folk who may be less familiar with the Pugwash conferences on world affairs, these were started back in the 50s. It sort of came out of the Bertrand Russell Albert Einstein statement in 1955 that sort of galvanized the scientific community about nuclear weapons and about being engaged with this from a professional evidence and ethics point of view. And they were particularly helpful in sort of track 2 diplomacy, bringing scientists from particularly both sides of the Cold War, largely US and Russian, together in informal sort of safe spaces where they could create the ongoing dialogue that was important to helping to, the back route channels that provided some basis for de-escalating nuclear risks and slowing, if not reversing, the nuclear arms race. Joseph Ortblatt, who was the long-standing president of Pugwash, and Pugwash got the Nobel Peace Prize in 1995. And I have to take this opportunity to pay tribute to Joe. He was the only one of the Manhattan scientists most of whom joined when the justification for the Manhattan Project that first developed nuclear weapons was the very well-grounded fear that Nazi Germany had a nuclear weapons program, and if it reached fruition first, there would be little hesitation to use them, and they had to be beaten to that. Joe was the only one of the thousands of scientists employed in that program who, when it became clear by late 1944 that Nazi Germany was nowhere near anywhere close remotely to nuclear weapons, left the program as that justification evaporated. Incredible moral courage. So Pugwash continues as an important sort of opportunity for dialogue in the and exchange in the global scientific community. It's perhaps a little less.
So that was Joe who? What was his surname?
Rotblat.
Rotblat.
Rotblat. R-O-T-B-L. Yeah. Rotblat.
Yeah, for those who are going to do some Googling afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely wonderful man. Died not that long ago in his 90s. I met him when he was just about 90 and sharp as a tack. I mean, if I had a brain like that when I was 30, I would have been happy. But yes, Pugwash is still around, and there's not a Pugwash organisation in Australia, unfortunately. So I don't know that there's an easy opportunity, but it's certainly a commendable organisation.
So we'll just take one more question from the floor, and then I think we'll have to wrap it up. Leanna Dalton asks, she says, it seems that it'll only take a few dozen average nuclear bombs to decimate life on Earth from the climate effects. Why do countries have hundreds of thousands?
Very good question. Because the policies on which those weapons were accrued were, simply put, were not based in evidence. Were not based on a realistic understanding of what the consequences of those weapons are. I mean, having arsenals of thousands of nuclear weapons is completely divorced from any reality. The idea that these are military tools that could be used with any precision, that, you know, the idea of winning a nuclear war. I mean, there's been so much deliberate obfuscation and myth-making and disguising the truth, misinformation about what nuclear weapons do over many decades. Let me give you just two examples. One is the sort of civil defense. I mean, many countries had civil defense programs in the 50s and 60s, some of them even into the 70s, where basically, you know, the population was sort of aimed to be convinced that, you know, if they had a few shovels, duck and cover, stockpiled, you know, a couple of weeks worth of tinned food and water in their home, and built a simple shelter in their backyard and dug a hole and put some doors over the top of it, you know, they could hide away for a couple of weeks and come out again when the sun was shining and it was all over. And, you know, completely lacking in evidence. And those programs, some of them, you know, took hundreds of millions of dollars in preparations. And it was really medical and scientific evidence in the early 80s that showed that they were completely fraudulent and that they then fell away. I would have thought that the evidence that I've shown you and its predecessors, you know, when the phenomenon of nuclear winter was discovered, when at least in the 80s there was some serious research done by national academies of science, by the International Council of Scientific Unions, you know, major international research projects. In fact, the forerunner of the IPCC, I reckon, was really the ICSU collaboration on nuclear winter research, which Barry Pittock, head of atmospheric research at CSIRO, was the lead author on the first volume of. Another great Australian contribution. But, you know, with the recent findings of major global climatic impacts, even with a limited regional nuclear war, I would have thought that should have every government in the world scrambling to commission their national research organisations to check the veracity of that research. What does that mean for our security, for our food and water security, for our population in plausible scenarios of nuclear war? But no government, none, have actually done that. It's really a case of sort of willful denial. So most of the scientific work that I've shown you is, you know, has been an initiative of individual committed and concerned scientists. So that's why I think the role of evidence is so crucial in bringing this discussion back to reality. And you know, we need evidence-based public policy on in every sphere.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
All right, so let's wrap it up there. And once again, I'd like to thank Tilman for giving such a wonderful presentation. And now the chat lines are just filled up with congratulations and thanks for your fantastic work.